Hi everyone, my name is Bea. I was one of the CAs for Australs 2024, and today I'll be discussing one of the motions that we set as part of the ESL final. So the motion is that we regret the influence of the Filipino Catholic Church in the People Power Revolution. There is an info slide which I'll let you read. And so while you read, I'll discuss a bit about why we set this in the ESL final. Moving into the motions, we knew we wanted to have novel and challenging finals motions. And so we had broad themes and ideas. In the open final, we broadly wanted a migration themed debate. And so we had a number of migration motions, some of them very specific, like the Australian migration motion, which was eventually debated, the South Korea migration motion, as well as a general migration themed debate. And then for the EFL final, we also generally wanted to be somewhat political. And so we had a Jakarta capital city relocation project debate and also Malaysia semiconductor project debate. And so for the ESL final, we were looking at religion. And eventually we settled on this to be part of the set because we felt that this mixes religion alongside politics. And so that's why this became one of the motions that we ended up considering and setting for the ESL final. And so I think if you were able to read the info side, it is implying very heavily a very political leaning, but also because of the influence of the Catholic Church, we felt that it was also important to have that component. That's why we set it in the ESL final. We also felt that it is a bit spec and a bit more requiring of some knowledge. And so we wanted it to be something that teams could also engage in meaningfully. And that's why we put it in an out round rather than in the preliminary rounds where we were worried that the spec could make it somewhat imbalanced. Whereas we felt that in a final, this was something that we expected to that level that teams would be able to debate and also would be able to meaningfully converse into the depth that it required. And so eventually, I want to just go into very quick thoughts about what I think is important to note before going into each side. For the regrets part, I do think that because it's regrets, a lot of the things I will be talking about will start off first with the counterfactual. I think it's important to emphasize the counterfactual is very, very important in this motion, as in many other historical debates, like this House regrets the Arab Spring, which was set in the UADC 2024 Open Semifinal, or any other forms of debates that do require you regretting a motion or regretting a historical event. There have been motions like this House regrets the partition of India, this House regrets insert a specific historical event here. Those types of motions, I think, are very, very important to have a counterfactual for, because if you're on Gov, it's very, very easy for you to explain why all of it has been harmful. But if you don't have a counterfactual, it's very easy as well to be able to wash off a lot of those harms. So having a counterfactual is important to be able to create a delta. And I think that I'm not saying that there's going to be a Philippine Catholic Church PPR debate again. And probably it's not going to be reset because it was set at Australs. But I think what you can probably get from this is I think it's important to go into and approach debates like these, i.e., a post-conflict, post-revolution debate, to go into what is a likely counterfactual, what are ideas of counterfactuals, using this as a case study. But I also think, secondly, it's not just Catholic Church bad or good, but it's specifically the influence. And so I think that's quite important because you want to concretize what it means, right? So the burden here isn't just to be like the Catholic Church is bad because they hate gay people, they are bad because they're very exclusive. No, no, no. Like obviously those things can be part and can be components. You can explain it as an influence that the influence of the Catholic Church has been very, very strong. Hence why it's been very hard for you to pass a lot of legislation that supports a lot of gay people, that supports a lot of individuals who undergo abortions, that supports a lot of individuals who have to go through divorce because divorce remains illegal in the Philippines. So I think those types of things become more concrete, but also more crucially as well, it's not just the Catholic Church good or bad, right? Because you're situating it as the influence of the Filipino Catholic Church during the People Power Revolution, the discussions of a post-conflict state, what do they look like? They are discussing a constitution. They are discussing the ways that governments are going to be reconfigured, restructured, political parties, and how they appeal to people, their sensibilities. I think those types of things also become quite meaningful and quite important because you're not just looking at the Catholic Church as an actor, but their influence to other actors that are also important. I think is very, very crucial in a motion and a debate like this. And finally, as well, in the People Power Revolution. So I'm not saying that you should learn a lot about the PPR. I do think it's helpful because I think if I were to condense the PPR into three-part component. A lot of people believe it's nonviolent. Again, contentious, some debaters or some people, academics will say that that sanitizes a lot of what actually happened in the underground movement, but broadly that's a consensus that it is something that was nonviolent. It was something that happened without bloodshed and without having to go to war. And it was secondly as well more successful to an extent because it was somewhat able to remove a dictator in power. But again, that's somewhat controversial because then people would say that, it wasn't fully a revolution because you didn't change elite leadership. It just changed hands from Marcos to Aquino. And that wasn't something that changed meaningfully the structure of the Philippines. And so that is what a few academics and a few debaters might run. But I think that's broadly a consensus that, it was somewhat successful if the goal was specifically just to oust one leader who was a dictator. And of course, the final thing about the people power revolution that is broadly a consensus is that it was something that was very powerful to an extent. There was a lot of replications of it, or to an extent, it did become something of a world headline when it happened in 1986. And also domestically, of course, it was somewhat very, very strong. I mean, until now, it's something that's taught in schools. Until now, at least for me, when I was growing up, it was thought to be where democracy was refound. And so it is a very democratically leaning revolution. It is something that was considered to be broadly beneficial as a revolution, but because that is something that's much more contested than the rest of the things I just said, especially because after it, and this is something you can adopt in other debates as well, post-revolution, a post-conflict, post-revolution state has democratic backsliding because of the struggles that come with being a new state. That's what happens in other institutions like the Arab Spring, and why, even the most successful quote-unquote state within the Arab Spring, like Tunisia, for instance, at this point in time, is increasingly becoming less and less democratic, for instance. Or in the Philippines, why after Marcos was taken out and you had the new presidents, Cory Aquino, and then after that, Fidel V. Ramos, and then after that, Erap, and then after that, Gloria, and after that, so on and so forth, Noynoy Aquino. Eventually, you had Rodrigo Duterte, who questioned populistically the structure of democracy because there was a lot of democratic anger and democratic angst associated with commemorating the PPR, because people said that after the PPR things didn't really change. In fact, it got worse potentially because now it's no longer a stable dictator leadership. Now it's a weak democracy with a lot of debts to the IMF, with a lot of austerity measures. We no longer had electricity, we no longer had water. Those types of things become what you hear from a lot of people who say that the PPR itself, while initially successful, might not have been long-term very democratic, might not have led to a lot of democracy anyway, because you still had a PPR2 that happened during Erap's term. You still had a lot of corruption that happened after that, when now the leader or the president, Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, was calling up the Commission on Elections saying, am I winning or not? So all of those things are a bit more spec. But all to say that I think broadly, if you want to summarize the PPR, people view it broadly as nonviolent. People view it broadly as successful, at the very least, at taking out a Marcos in power. And most contentiously, people saw it as democratic, but it's unsure whether or not it was long-term democratic. So I think that's quite important because you can adapt that to other non-PPR structures, whether or not a revolution itself or an event itself was leading to more democracy or not, whether or not a revolution or an event itself was able to actually unseat a lot of power, or did it just replace that leader with someone else who was another elite, someone else who was also part of the institution? And what did that lead to in terms of the outcomes of their approaches to democracy? Again, as I've kind of implied, in the Philippines, a lot of it led to a lot of populist rhetoric that became very, very, very persuasive to a lot of voters. Hence why Rodrigo Duterte was able to win. Hence why after Rodrigo Duterte, the son of the dictator that was exiled because of the PPR, Bongbong Marcos, became president. And a lot of that, forms of resentment could also be something you could argue that have happened in other states as well with very similar values. All to say that I think, this isn't just a PPR debate, but it's also about post-conflict, post-revolution debate that I think you can adopt to other types of debates, even if you don't actually have to just see a Philippine debate. Going into the Gov arguments, I want to go into the framing. As I've mentioned, again, the counterfactual is very important because this is a debate where I think, again, it's very intuitive on government to just give a lot of reasons for why churches are bad. But I think it's very, very important for you to first frame what you would prefer as an alternative. Because if you say the church is very bad, that's fine. That's potentially quite easy. But it's unsure why your alternative would have been a lot more solvent at getting to, some levels of democracy. You can approach this in different ways. My thought about this motion is that I think you definitely have to go into, we would prefer more secularism. We would likely have had more influence from social movements. The ways that I would say you can prove it are going into how alternative movements are relatively successful at doing it. So I kind of go into it here when I go into underground movements. So I mean, I kind of go into all these parts. So I kind of want to explain a bit more info about this. Because it was a 20-year-long dictatorship, there were a number of different underground movements, underground groups who were using violence and using armed revolution to be able to challenge the government. And they were becoming initially more successful because people start to be somewhat more sympathetic to them, especially because they view, as the people, as the mainstream public, they see that individuals are being constrained rights, are, family members are not being able to go home, things feel unsafe, and you're uncertain whether or not the news is actually going to exist because the news is very heavily censored, or there are constant ways in which the franchises of a lot of these news centers and news outlets are being removed. So because of a lack of free and democratic movement, people become increasingly more sympathetic towards the underground movement. And so you have a lot more people going into that as well. But also, I think in terms of general civil society as well, there is a lot of domestic concern towards it. And people increasingly become more and more worried. People increasingly become more and more internally critical. Even if they're still scared of the Marcoses, they start to, become a lot more questioning of it. And also, the Marcoses can't fully sustain themselves after 20 years as a singular dictator as well, because people constantly, lose support for a dictatorship that obviously becomes more and more economically and politically unsustainable when they lose a lot of allies. The second is a bit more spec about legal challenges. And so one of the reasons why the PPR happened, aside from, as mentioned in the info slide, the CBCP supporting it, it also was because the military also stopped supporting Marcos. And so there were a lot of initially aligned supporters of Marcos, initially aligned military men who were part of Marcos's team who stopped and therefore, started telling people as well, go to 𝐂𝐨𝐧𝐝, which was the street in which People Power Revolution happened. Go join the PPR, go join the revolution, fight against the Marcoses. And so it was also a legal and political challenge internally because while the Marcoses were a dictatorship and they were able to monopolize a lot of power, other elites were also starting to be challenge too. Other elites felt that, because a lot of the money is going and flowing into the Marcoses, I'm losing money too. Other military men also felt that maybe this is something I no longer want to support because now the Marcoses are undermining me. So that's something that you can note. But specifically for the family that was also displaced by the Marcoses, that includes the Aquinos. The Aquinos, if you've ever flown into Manila or you will fly into Manila, hopefully by the time that you're seeing this is still named, Aquino International Airport. And that's because he was shot in that airport. And he was abroad because he was facing a lot of political persecution. He flies home to the Philippines against the advice of his family and his leadership and his, lawyers, etc. He gets shot when he arrives. That anger that people had because he was a senator who was very, very critical of martial law, was very, very critical of the Marcoses, led to his wife, Cory Aquino, running for president. And so when she ran for president and then she lost in a snap election called by Marcos, a lot of the people felt that that was vote buying and election tampering. And it included people walking out, the people who were counting votes, because what they felt like when they were counting votes, when they would see another Aquino name, Aquino name, Aquino name, but then it would still continuously be Marcos, 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 meant that people felt like the system itself was rigged. And so that's why eventually there was a strong push for PPR politically. So these institutions aren't uniquely tied to the church, but they are also political machineries. There are also other elites, other forms of institutions, like the military, for instance, have become increasingly less supportive of the Marcoses because it was already coming to the end of the term in which there was just mounting pressure from all sides. But of course, the way that the PPR has been portrayed is very much in the nuns who are holding rosaries, is very much in the non-violent aspect of it. That's underscored by the idea that it was the church through the radio who pushed for people to participate in it. Of course, the final thing is just, even if you don't buy that internally there was a lot more mounting pressure, like within civil society, but also within formal institutions as well, there was less support from external institutions like the United States that eventually has pulled out funding and has pulled out a lot of support for the Marcoses. And so you could argue different ways in which that probably would have manifested if it did not occur, i.e. the PPR. Maybe they would have funded a lot of these other alternative groups. But also more crucially as well, and I think this is applicable to a lot of debates like this because the United States, all these other groups in more modern history become quite crucial and quite integral in terms of how much funding they give into countries and in terms of their opposition groups. So I think those things are quite helpful. I wrote down here educational systems, although I would say that they're still domestic in terms of just, they become increasingly more critical as well, the Marcoses. So all of these things are potential alternatives, I would say. The way that I'd frame it, but again, your mileage may vary. It might be different for you in terms of what you think is more strategic in the debates that you would be in. My thoughts are all of this creates a basket of different groups that would likely make a more secular movement. And so, they would have been very, very strong anyway, and they would have been a very, very, maybe not as united, but definitely a large PPR. But second, even if they aren't as large and as unifying, and even if it's slower, in the worst case on our side, and so this part that I said at the top, like in terms of like whether or not the trade-off exists, I just think that like it's quite important to explain. So here, this part, like this part. I think that obviously a trade-off is quite important and quite helpful, but I would kind of not use it as a first response. I would probably just go into like, firstly, here are all the ways in which you'd still have some level of PBR that's very, very unifying, etc., etc. But even if we trade that off, it likely would still be relatively better because all these other alternatives that we just explained, these things that I just said here, are relatively a lot easier for you to question, are a lot likelier to become more accountable, and therefore create less harms from the Catholic Church, which you can identify. The first thing I just note is that there is an important hurdle, the very, very intuitive up response that on either side, the Catholic Church will be a dominant force in the Philippines. The way that I would deal with it on Gov is just, I'd say, yes, they're going to be influential either way, but just because it's symmetric doesn't mean that the scale is the same, right? It's because of the PPR, they were able to have significantly more power because they were legitimated a lot more when after PPR, the Philippines as a post-conflict, post-revolution state was very, very vulnerable. And so when President Cory Aquino's Catholic values were very, very emphasized, or when people's primary images of the PPR were nuns praying the rosary, were priests and cardinals speaking into the radio, urging them to go to the PPR and to rally and protest in EDSA, then it created the idea that democracy is attributed to Catholicism and people became a lot more indebted to Catholicism. So I think those are ways in which you can still explain there's a scale. Obviously, in either side, they're going to be influential, but it's a difference of them being kingmaker versus them being one of the many groups that exist that can be more accountable, that can be more questioned. And because when they're reified, that means it's a lot harder for you to be able to fully hold them accountable. Second, even if the church is strong either way, it would have been preferable to have alternative institutions in order to temper the church's power. And so that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of, what are alternative institutions that existed? Because remember, emphasizing here is a dominant force. And so yes, they would have been important and they would have been a dominant force anyway, but the explanation of how much of that share of that force would have been in the hands of the Catholic Church changes significantly if it was primarily attributed to secular institutions or other forms of institutions that aren't as, based around Catholicism, maybe aren't as dogmatic, and therefore would have been relatively strong or relatively better. I also want to note that even outside of the Catholic Church, going into, broad churches and broad Catholicism adjacent forms of religion, they are very, very influential in the Philippines. They still remain very important in block voting. They still remain very important in terms of, elections being decided by their endorsements. And so I think it might also be helpful to go into, because of this like prioritization on Catholic Church in general, it also emphasizes a lot of support for other forms of religions that are very, very close to Catholicism, that do emphasize things like cult leadership, etc., or that do emphasize things like being able to prioritize similar forms of values and similar forms of ideas and identities. Obviously, the opposite of that is also true for the ones that are less adjacent. It's also less prioritized as well. And then of course, that also creates different forms of resentment, which I want to go into in a bit more detail in the next slide or in the next slide. So the first argument I would probably just run is just, the church's influence is bad. And it's very hard for you to hold accountable when it is something that you attribute democracy to. So I think that the burdens of proof, I listed a lot, but I just think that it's helpful for you to cover your ground here. I think it's quite intuitive, but I do think that, hey, you want to establish why they don't just have massive influence, they have like influence that is incredibly much larger than just being like, a lobbying group. It's that they, again, as I've said earlier, are kingmakers. They are very, very important, influential parts of the democracy and the democratic process. So that's what I think is quite important here in terms of the massive influence. I don't just think it's like, they can lobby. No, no, no. It's that they control which politicians get into power. They're able to solidify and enshrine into constitutions what they want to be more important, what their definitions are of minority groups, blah, blah, blah. Those types of things I think are quite important. Secondly, why the Catholic Church specifically receives its influence. So if you explain already that they have massive influence, you want to go into why is this a tipping point. So that's why the initial thing that we just talked about is quite important. Because again, Op's gonna be like, that's not the tipping point. You go into the reasons you just had for why it is a tipping point, and it is important. And then you go into why the alternative counterfactual would have led to less church influence, i.e., if it is a lot more secular institutions, maybe there is still some Catholic Church influence. We're not saying we're going to fix the world, but at the very least, it's relatively a bit more accountable. It's relatively a bit easier for you to push and challenge because of different institutions, and that's why it's better. So I think those types of things are good because you demonstrate the counterfactual and also explain that, we're not promising you a perfect world, but we are promising, or at the very least claiming, that we're going to be somewhat better. That's enough to win the debate. And then finally, you have to trade-off. Maybe we have lesser democracy that's slower, but again, we have a lot of the mitigations for why it would have become democratic still, and also why, even if it's slower, at the very least, it's not something that is shock, or at least adapts or clings to religiosity because it's so new and because it's so shocking and so change like ridden, right? But now it becomes a bit slower. Maybe it's a bit easier for you to be able to integrate different religions, different groups, and that's why it's relatively better. So the other thing I wanted to go into was the political influence long term. So this one, for instance, I think is very, very focused on the church's influence. And you can obviously impact that in so many ways. But I think this one in particular is focused on the political aspect that I was mentioning earlier, the forms of resentment. So this one is about, their influence in lobbying, their influence in constitutions, their influence in the state as a whole. I think here is just why it creates mockery of politics. That's a bit of an excessive way to characterize it, but I think that's kind of the way that I would say my head was at when I was thinking about this argument. So I think here the way that I go into it is to just go into what are the Catholic Church values and influences bad in terms of state formation. A lot of it is that, Catholic Church is divisive. It creates in-groups and out-groups. It's very, very dogmatic. And the Philippines in particular advertise a very, very traditional conservative view of Catholicism, unlike, Latin American forms and churches that potentially are a lot more advocating of liberation theology. The ones in the Philippines aren't as such, and there's a very, very strong push towards respecting authority and tradition and being able to prioritize a lot of dogmatic values that are pushed in the Catholic Church. Things like the cult of influence, cult of personalities, influences, the ways in which hierarchy and tradition are operating within the Catholic Church. And personally, the way I would probably point to this is to explain that the Catholic Church orders in the Philippines that dominate, yes, there are some more somewhat progressive orders like the Jesuits, but the dominant majority of them are very, very authoritarian to an extent, but I guess the more appropriate word is hierarchical and traditional. And so all of those things probably create worse political structure because of the ways that advertisements work, worse the ways in which, a lot of the values of respect are inculcated, and that's something that's a lot harder for you to question. But more so as well, it probably creates some level of weaker state formation because you aren't able to have a very strong civil society that is independent of the church. Things like social movements advocating for civil rights that are often traditionally encapsulated in Catholic churches, especially for gay rights, especially for, again, divorce being still illegal in the Philippines, again, which is quite insane because even other Catholic states are able to have divorce legally. Abortion rights, reproductive health, which is something that was very, very strongly opposed by the Philippine Catholic Church. So I think the discussion of it on the level of civil society is important. The discussion of it in terms of politicians and how a lot of it creates that form of endorsement culture, I think is important. But also I think it's probably quite helpful to look into, and this is my other note, although it's a bit spec, it's just the ways that a lot of the resentment is formed around the Aquinos. The Aquinos, again, were seen as Catholics. We're seen as a family you want to prioritize. And a lot of the family values in the Philippines, especially in Catholicism, is part of it too. And obviously, it's not unique to that, but it is a big part of it to an extent. And so, being able to reify a lot of these institutions and a lot of these politicians who are Catholic, I think creates some level of cementing a lot of these familial dynasties, in particular the Aquinos, which I think might be quite important, quite interesting to use as a case for that. But I think that the initial two ones are a bit more intuitive, and so those are, I think, sufficient as well to be able to prove this. I also think I already explained why you're likely to adapt to these values more and not question it, because you need to not question things post-conflict. So that's why you're likely to be unstable in the long term, because there becomes a lot of resentment towards Catholic Church because of that. Then you can go into why the church's influence was exclusive, i.e., because a lot of it was based in maybe Manila, maybe in specific areas that did have Catholicism as dominant majority. It might have been quite exclusive to a lot of groups, especially in Mindanao, especially in areas in which a lot of that was not attributed to Catholic Church, and so they were often ignored in history books in the ways that they are written, which also does create a lot of instability and a lot of resentment towards Manila elites. And again, on either side, there's going to be some level of Manila elitism and some level of resentment. But the discussion on how much this reifies it, I think, is also quite important and quite helpful, especially because they often are ignored in a lot of historical discussions. And so I think it's quite important to be able to discuss how much of that reification hurts a lot of religious minorities as well. And I think that's very, very important to discuss as well in Philippine context, given that it is a dominant Philippine Catholic majority. But the push for, liberation and autonomous regions for Muslim Mindanao, for instance, in Bangsamoro, are also becoming hot button topics because it's a majority Muslim region within a majority Catholic country in an area that is very far from the capital and often historically ignored. And so I think those things are also quite helpful in discussing how much of that creates a level of resentment and a lot of instability domestically, because the Philippines fails to support a lot of its minority religions as well. And again, you can still be like, on either side is going to be some level of resentment, but maybe it's a lot easier to politically participate for a lot of these groups if they are not the dominant majority Catholicism reified as well. So you strengthen it a lot more. I think finally as well, outside of that resentment, I think it's also helpful to go into what are all these alternative groups' relationships with the Catholic Church. So again, maybe it's like you pit the underground movement against Catholic Church, especially when you make them feel like they are not being heard, not being seen in terms of their sacrifices, and you sanitize the movement to become somewhat more peaceful, something that was bloodless, but in fact actually claimed the lives of so many individuals. And so I think that form of displacement, I think, is helpful in terms of assessing why it creates some level of instability. And again, I think the discussions about what happens right directly after Marcos is also quite important and quite helpful. All that to say, again, I think I've adapted it very, very much into the Philippine context, but I think hopefully it gives you an idea for how to also approach this type of motion for non-Philippine context, given that I think, there are so many states in the world that have historically had post-conflict societies that have become very influenced by religions to an extent, captured by elites, captured by dominant majorities who become exclusionary. And, there are different ways it applies. And I'm not saying you should copy-paste what happens in the Philippines to go into the Balkans, what happened in the Philippines to go into Malaysia, etc. But I do think that they are helpful starting points for general debates as well, that maybe can give you some inspiration. And also maybe you can utilize Philippine matter here for Philippine motion to impress Philippine judges. I don't know. Maybe that might be helpful. For opposition then. So the framing is, as I said earlier, very heavily focused on just there is no counterfactual. There is no unified opposition. We need a unified opposition right now, at least at the very least, then to take down Marcos. And so you would make a trade-off that yes, there is incredibly strong Catholic influence. I think it's very hard to contest that on opposition. But without Cardinal Jaime Sin, there was no singular institution to unify Filipinos against the Marcoses. So I think that the approach is a bit straightforward. You would refute the alternatives and explain why either alternatives were weaker or would have similarly problematic issues. And I think it's very important to do this because if you allow Gov to construct the counterfactual, which they can, as I've said earlier, then I think you would be in a predicament on op, because a lot of the op claim is very, very contingent on democracy is necessary and democracy is uniquely going to exist just because of the Catholic Church. So you have to explain why this is the only way to do it, or if not, it is the only beneficial long-term way to do it. Like, why is it something that's uniquely a lot better than relying on underground movements that would probably splinter off? And why is it better than civil societies that maybe are a lot more fragmented, a lot more weak? Why is it better than maybe other potentially more inclusive forms? Because even if it's uninclusive, it does create an active change now, and we can probably and have changed society somewhat in terms of our organizations. And because it's still democratic anyway, it's not a theocracy, it's still going to be somewhat better. I think you have to do a lot of mitigatory work there to an extent, but also explain why, church is bad, but it's not as bad as XYZ alternatives. So I think you can do a lot of that depending on and adapting on to what God says as their alternative. I do think it's quite important for you as well to really force democratization as a primary value to an extent. Obviously, you can still be like, look, on either side, you're going to have some level of instability. And, democratization is a primary value, but what we do prioritize is just taking out the dictatorship who hurts a lot of people. But I think, would also want to just take the hard line and just be like, look, even if you have to defend that we had some level of instability on our side, democracy is still better in the long term. Because I think it's a very, very easy way for you to just go into the long term part. As I said earlier, though, I think that for the Catholic Church being a dominant force in the Philippines, I think that Gov can utilize it by still explaining why them being a dominant force uniquely happened because of 1987. But I think that it's also very, very helpful for you to still be like, it's not just that. It's been the 333 years of Spanish colonization and the very strong influences of Catholicism because of that throughout the other forms of colonizations and occupations we've had from the United States and Japan. So it's very, very dominant because of that history. And it's not just that, but also that, because it would exist either way. The Gov alternative is oppositional to the Catholic Church. If you believe that there's resentment from other smaller groups against the Catholic Church on Gov's side, you probably would also believe that the Catholic Church would be resentful towards these other groups for not including it. And therefore, when they don't sufficiently recognize the Catholic Church's role, that could also weaken the Gov alternative by putting that alternative as antithetical to the Catholic Church. And secondly, you could also just explain that, a lot of the values and policies that Gov proposes harms would exist anyway in some capacity. And so maybe there is a scale of increased Catholic influence, decreased Catholic influence on either Op or Gov. But I think it's like, sure, but it doesn't matter as much in terms of whether you have a bit more lobbying power for the church or not, but rather about, because it's going to be symmetric, but rather about the success of being able to overthrow a dictatorship. And that's why, again, I want to focus on democratization as a primary value. So the first thing really is just why the Catholic Church was necessary. And so I wanted you to go into the reasons for why religion is unifying. And it's like, the historical thing I just mentioned, but also that Catholicism is uniquely unifying because it is an institution that is somewhat ubiquitous. Even in areas in which there are other minority groups that exist, the Catholic Church has very, very strong education institutions like the Ateneos across the world, or across specifically the Philippines, of which I also was a product of, or a lot of the other ways in which it has happened. I mean, outside of Ateneo, you still have the Lasallian schools, you have a lot of different schools, even the ones I've been to in my entire life, except for the current institution I'm in now, are ones that are, non-secular. And so because they are so strong, even for individuals who aren't part of the Catholic Church is a unifying point because even if you're a minority, it becomes somewhat syncretic to an extent. So I think those are ways you can approach it and kind of counter the Gov push. But I think you can also explain that, even if it's not the case, you're still able to amplify the dominant majority, which is what you needed to be able to activate power against Marcos. And that's why it's a lot more strong, a lot better. But also, it's very, very stable compared to social movements that constantly change, compared to groups that constantly change their memberships. Maybe it is not the most progressive, but on either side, it's not going to be progressive. It's 1986. At the very least, on our side, on opposition, it's a bit more unifying. That's why it's good. And then I would probably still try to explain that it's going to not be that bad in terms of their influence. But I would go into, look, even if the long-term power of the Catholic Church creates a level of unaccountability and unquestionability, it's worth it because you are still able to have a democracy. You are still able to create a new leadership. And again, maybe the Catholic Church still has a lot of influence and still has a lot of power, but they would likely be very heavily relegated to a lot of personal values and personal legislation versus just you being able to vote. Like, yes, maybe you delay the ability for you to have as many rights for women, and maybe you are not able to have reproductive health, etc. But again, it's uncertain whether or not it's going to pass in Gov, and therefore that's not the debating issue. The debating issue is about how you're able to have a larger expansion of civil rights for everyone as a whole. I think it's a bit unideal, and it's a bit on the like less social justice, less progressive side. But I think that it is a bit easier if you look at it in the weighing of what is certain and what isn't. Because you can totally agree that it's important for you to have progressive rights. And you can still be like, even in status quo now, maybe you don't have a lot of strong protections, but the Philippines is somewhat more gender equal than many other Southeast Asian nations, is a lot better at being able to represent queer people in media, even if it's imperfect. And so you can give some of these mitigations. I'm not a big personal fan of them as mitigations, but I think that if you want to be very pragmatic about it, that's one way for you to deal with it on government side and explain that, on Gov, like the margin of change isn't that massive. Whereas on our side, we overthrow a dictator. That's just uniquely beneficial because we stop people from dying. It does require for you to defend a bit of the Aquinos, the Ramoses later on, and to an extent the form of hatred and form of resentment. But I'd still explain that, that resentment would have been worse on their side because it's not clear who is the in-group and the out-group. And therefore, there would have been a lot more warring post-revolution states that would probably feel like it's something that was very, very power vacuumy, very hard for you to be able to assess who actually is in power. I think secondly and finally, you can also go into a bit more detail for why there's more domestic stability. So it's a flip of what you're talking about for the second Gov argument, but just broadly why, and I think why the Catholic Church's influence was good, even if it was very dominant. And that's because, post-conflict, people needed a moral leader. And so they needed to have that identity. They needed to be able to have the capacity to feel like they have someone to give them hope. But I also think that you can try to also explain that, the Philippines itself isn't uniquely too conservative. Yes, there are conservative orders, but the Philippines is somewhat, again, more adaptable in terms of domestic forms of religion and domestic forms of Catholicism. The way that Spanish colonialism happened in terms of the way that Catholicism existed was also it became very heavily adapted domestically and locally. We have our own folk saints, we have our own Spanish ethnicity, but Filipino-born friars during that colonial period that were able to adopt it very, very much into the parochial schools, into the parishes as well in terms of how they operate. And so a lot of Catholicism becomes very, very localized. And so it's not an imposition anymore. It's oftentimes reflective now of a lot of these values, and that's good. And you can explain that's good because these things are a lot easier for people to adapt to, and also more crucially as well, maybe are good values for individuals to have. So it does require defense of the Catholic Church. I think those are potential ways that you can approach it, especially if you, like me, feel like that's a bit harder to do because of personal biases. I think secondly, you can go into as well why the Catholic Church, when it influenced the state negatively, was still held accountable. And again, notice that a lot of the strongest arguments that I thought were quite important for Gov wasn't just Catholic Church bad, but Catholic Church unaccountable when it makes bad decisions. And so on up, I just be like, look, you can still hold it accountable because it's still democracy. In the Gov alternative, when it's created a lot slower, the Catholic Church would still exist, but it's a lot harder for you to hold it accountable as well because now you don't have democratic institutions earlier. You don't have them established very, very clearly because now people have warring factions. And so, it is a lot likelier that you're going to hold it more accountable. And I think finally as well, I'd probably weigh out that resentment happens regardless, but also explain for the reasons I've said earlier, the Catholic Church is more ubiquitous because, again, it is all over the Philippines, even when it's not directly a parish, even when it's not directly a church, but that, it influences some portion of education systems. And, it probably is able to also become more reflective of people. Again, that's something Gov can flip by saying that, that's exactly why it's that. But I think that, if you say that, that's probably going to happen either way, and also explain that, people are going to be very, very loyal to the Catholic Church. It actually means that it's better because now the Catholic Church is not an outsider to these institutions. They're likely to have people to opt into the political process. And that's why maybe it's not perfect right now. And you led to Duterte, you led to Marcos. Point two. But at the very least, you have an institution that is far longer, and therefore you don't constantly have a lot of coups, which might have happened if the military leadership were in power, which might have happened if civil leadership was in power, which might have happened if social movements that were underground were in power. And therefore, those types of things create relatively stronger forms of stability. So I think at the end of this, for this motion, I think it's a debate about relativism. It's about what is relatively better, relatively stronger, relatively more stable for the status quo. And the reason I'm saying that is because, like any other historical debate, it's going to be intuitive on whichever side you personally feel stronger about. I personally feel like it's a lot easier for me to criticize the Catholic Church. I think for a lot of other people, they might find that it's a lot easier to just be like, democracy is good as a value. I think that going into, look, on either side, there's some influence of the Catholic Church. On either side, there's some level of democracy you might get. I think being able to measure how much more the relativism is I think what allows you to win these debates a lot more thoroughly and a lot more clearly. So I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you also have a great time at UADC. All the best.